Hey everyone! Tonight we're talking about all the moments when medieval humanity came dangerously close to deleting itself, not because of meteors or monsters, but because of deeply confident bad decisions. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. If medieval medicine had a customer satisfaction survey, the results would have been difficult to interpret, mostly because the customers were no longer alive. The core medical philosophy of the Middle Ages was beautifully simple. If something is wrong inside the body, remove fluids until either balance is restored or the patient stops complaining permanently. This approach was called bloodletting, and it was the medieval equivalent of fixing your computer by throwing it out a window, effective in one very specific sense. Doctors believed the human body was governed by four humors, and illness meant one of them was misbehaving. Which one wasn't especially important? The cure, regardless of symptoms, was almost always the same. Fever? Bloodletting. Infection? Bloodletting. Cough? Bloodletting. Feeling a bit sad? Bloodletting just to stay ahead of things. The reasoning went like this. Sick people are weak. Therefore, they must have too much blood. Remove it, preferably quickly. The process itself was not gentle. Veins were opened with knives, sometimes repeatedly. Leeches were applied and left to do what leeches do best, silently judge your life choices while draining you. Patients were often bled until they fainted, which doctors interpreted as a promising sign. Unconsciousness meant the treatment was working. Even worse, bloodletting wasn't optional. It was mainstream medicine. Refusing it didn't make you cautious, it made you non-compliant. And in medieval terms, that meant everyone quietly agreed your death was your own fault. Doctors who didn't bleed patients were viewed with suspicion. After all, how could someone recover if they still had all their blood? During epidemics, this practice went from questionable to catastrophic. People already weakened by hunger, cold, dehydration, and infection were relieved of the very substance keeping their organs functioning. Immune systems collapsed. Recovery became a rumor. The truly impressive part is that medieval doctors often doubled down. If the patient worsened, it simply meant not enough blood had been removed. The solution to a failing treatment was more treatment. From a modern perspective, this looks like a slow-motion disaster. From a medieval perspective, it was careful, responsible medicine. And that's the terrifying part. Humanity didn't just fight disease. It politely escorted it inside, handed it a knife, and said, "Please, take your time." And somehow, against every medical instinct, people survived long enough to stop doing this. Once medieval medicine finished bleeding people into the afterlife, medieval dietary advice stepped in to make sure anyone left standing didn't recover too comfortably. Because when you're already starving, cold, and diseased, the logical next step is to avoid the few foods that might actually help you survive. During famines and outbreaks, medieval authorities warned people against eating fruits and vegetables, not because they were spoiled, but because they were considered too moist. Moist foods, according to medical theory, corrupted the humors. This was taken very seriously. Apples were suspicious. Greens were dangerous. Fresh food in general was viewed as a kind of dietary criminal. Instead, people were encouraged to eat heavy, dry foods, meat, stale bread, thick porridge, and wine. This advice worked wonderfully if you were a well-fed noble with a stocked cellar. For everyone else, it was essentially a starvation strategy with religious backing. During famine, meat was rare, bread was rationed, wine was expensive. Fruits and vegetables were often the only food available, but eating them felt like gambling with your soul. So peasants made the responsible choice and continued not eating. And when they did eat, digestion became a nightmare. Heavy foods required energy to process, energy that sick and starving bodies didn't have. People weakened further. Immune systems quietly packed up and left town without notice. Medical authorities noticed people getting worse and reached a reasonable conclusion: the diet wasn't strict enough. Some doctors advised avoiding food almost entirely during illness, arguing that digestion distracted the body from healing. During outbreaks, people responded by eating less, much less, sometimes nothing at all. Children suffered the most. Growing bodies deprived of nutrition stopped growing, then stopped fighting infection, then stopped entirely. Entire generations were thinned not just by famine, but by the instructions on how to behave during it. And to make matters worse, hunger was often framed as spiritually beneficial. If you were starving, God was testing you. If you died, the test had concluded. From a modern perspective, this is baffling. From a medieval perspective, it was responsible self-control. Humanity didn't just face food shortages, it added rules, fear, and moral pressure, and nearly starved itself out of existence, politely, obediently, and with remarkable discipline. Medieval people had many impressive skills: farming without machinery, building cathedrals without calculators, surviving winters that actively wanted them dead. What they did not have was a working concept of water hygiene, and this oversight nearly erased entire cities. In medieval towns, waste management followed a simple, optimistic principle: not our problem once it leaves the house. Human waste, animal waste, food scraps, anything unpleasant was tossed into the street, dumped into open pits, or encouraged towards the nearest river. Rivers, in turn, were believed to have magical cleansing powers. If something went into the water upstream, it was obviously gone forever by the time it reached you. Science. Unfortunately, rivers did not share this belief. Medieval cities often built latrines directly over waterways. Entire neighborhoods flushed themselves into the same rivers they later used for drinking, washing, and brewing beer. If you ever wondered why medieval ale was so popular, it's because fermented liquid was statistically safer than water that had recently hosted a parade of human regrets. The result was predictable. One sick person upstream meant everyone downstream was participating in a communal biology experiment. Dysentery, cholera, and other waterborne illnesses spread with ease. Cities became self-sustaining disease machines, proudly recycling their own problems. And when outbreaks happened, no one suspected the water. Why would they? It looked clean, it tasted fine, it wasn't visibly screaming, "I am poison." Blame went elsewhere: bad air, sinful behavior, foreign influence, or the moon doing something suspicious again. People responded by burning incense, ringing church bells, or fleeing the city, often carrying the disease with them. The water remained untouched, unquestioned, and enthusiastically contaminated. Even attempts at cleanliness made things worse. Washing clothes added waste. Slaughterhouses drained directly into streams. Tanners soaked animal hides in water that later flowed into wells. It was an ecosystem of bad decisions working together in perfect harmony. The astonishing part is that medieval cities noticed something was wrong. Sickness followed certain water sources, entire neighborhoods suffered repeatedly. And yet, without germ theory, the conclusion was never "stop drinking that water." It was that something unseen was angry. From a modern perspective, medieval sanitation looks horrifying. From a medieval perspective, it was logical, traditional, and extremely unfortunate. Humanity didn't just poison itself, it did so efficiently, cooperatively, and every single day, one cup at a time. When disease struck medieval Europe, people desperately searched for a cause. Unfortunately, instead of discovering bacteria, they discovered vibes, and the vibes were bad. Clearly, something had to be blamed, and medieval society decided that something was cats. Cats had a public relations problem. They were quiet, independent, active at night, occasionally stared into corners like they knew something you didn't. During times of plague, that was more than enough to earn a death sentence.
Cats were associated with witches, demons, heresy, and general moral failure, none of which, unfortunately, are known carriers of disease. So medieval communities began killing them, a lot of them. This decision was made with confidence. If cats were evil and evil caused disease, then fewer cats must mean less disease. This was medieval epidemiology. Unfortunately, cats were also the primary predators of rats, and rats, as it turns out, were deeply involved in the entire plague situation. With cats gone, rat populations exploded. Rats moved freely through homes, grain stores, streets, and sleeping areas as if they had received a written invitation. Fleas followed. Fleas thrived, and the plague spread faster than ever. At no point did medieval society pause and say, "Interesting, ever since we removed the animals that kill rats, there seem to be more rats." That would have required observation, humility, and admitting a mistake, 3 things medieval crisis management actively avoided. Instead, the worsening plague was taken as proof that not enough cats had been eliminated, so the solution was escalated. More cats were killed, sometimes dogs too, just in case. Anything furry and vaguely suspicious became a target. This was not limited to one region. Entire towns participated. Cats were burned, drowned, chased away, or destroyed in public displays meant to cleanse the community spiritually. The rats watched quietly from the shadows, deeply appreciative of the new housing opportunities. The irony is painful. One of humanity's oldest allies, an animal that had lived alongside humans for thousands of years, was removed at the exact moment it was needed most, not because it failed, but because it was misunderstood. From a modern perspective, this looks like tragic comedy. From a medieval perspective, it was righteous action. Humanity didn't just fight disease poorly. It fired the one employee who was actually helping and promoted the rats instead. When medieval people realized disease wasn't responding to bloodletting, starvation, and cat elimination, they escalated to a bold new strategy: public self-harm combined with long-distance travel. This was known as the flagellant movement, and it may be one of history's most efficient examples of good intentions doing maximum damage. Flagellants believed plague was divine punishment. The solution, therefore, was to impress God with suffering. Groups of men gathered, stripped down to the waist, and marched from town to town, whipping themselves with chains, leather straps, and occasionally enthusiasm. The logic was simple. If God saw enough blood, he would stop the plague. This logic had already failed in hospitals, but hope springs eternal. These processions were not quiet. They were loud, dramatic, and highly contagious, spiritually and biologically. Flagellants sang hymns, drew crowds, and moved directly through densely populated towns. Sick people joined, healthy people joined. Everyone stood close together, breathing deeply, sharing air, sweat, and absolutely everything else. The result was predictable. Wherever the flagellants went, plague followed. Towns that had not yet been affected suddenly found themselves hosting a traveling festival of infection. Instead of isolating disease, medieval society turned it into a touring performance. Authorities occasionally tried to stop them. Some church leaders noticed that whipping yourself while spreading death was not, in fact, working. But by then, the movement had momentum. Flagellants didn't trust doctors, priests, or officials. They trusted pain. Pain felt productive. Pain felt meaningful. Pain looked like action. And so they marched on. The psychological appeal was strong. When everything feels out of control, doing something feels better than doing nothing, even if that something is objectively worse. The flagellants gave people purpose, certainty, and moral superiority, all while unknowingly accelerating population collapse. From a modern perspective, it's horrifying. From a medieval perspective, it was righteous action. Medieval cities were marvels of human achievement. Towering walls, bustling markets, narrow streets filled with life, commerce, and, unfortunately, everyone's bodily fluids. If disease were searching for ideal living conditions, medieval urban planning would have won an award. Cities grew fast and vertically, but not intelligently. Houses were packed so tightly, neighbors could borrow salt through the window. Streets were narrow, dark, and designed more for shadow than sunlight. Fresh air was considered optional. Ventilation was a rumor. People lived on top of each other because land inside city walls was valuable. The solution was simple: stack humans like firewood. Multiple families shared single buildings. Animals lived indoors. Chickens wandered through kitchens. Pigs strolled the streets like they owned the place, which, frankly, they kind of did. Waste management followed the same philosophy as everything else: minimal effort, maximum optimism. Refuse was tossed into the street. Chamber pots were emptied out windows, sometimes with a polite warning if you were lucky. Rain occasionally washed things away, which was considered a complete sanitation plan. When disease entered this environment, it didn't spread, it exploded. Close living meant constant contact. One cough reached 10 people. One fever meant a household outbreak. One infected rat meant an entire block was negotiating with death by the end of the week. Isolation was nearly impossible. Quarantine meant sleeping 6 inches farther away from the person coughing directly into your face. And yet, medieval cities believed density meant safety. Walls kept enemies out. Crowds meant protection. The idea that humans themselves could be the threat was uncomfortable. Much easier to blame air, stars, or moral decay than admit that living inside a human beehive might have consequences. Even worse, cities attracted people during crisis. When famine or war struck the countryside, peasants flooded into cities seeking food and work. Instead, they found overcrowding, disease, and a fast-track introduction to urban mortality. From the outside, medieval cities looked impressive. From the inside, they functioned like slow-moving incubators. Humanity didn't just suffer from disease, it lovingly constructed the perfect environment for it, brick by brick, wall by wall, person by person. And still, cities grew. Because despite everything, people preferred dying together inside walls than alone outside them. Once medieval society accepted that disease wasn't politely staying inside city walls, it needed something to blame. Unfortunately, germs were invisible, and medieval people did not trust invisible things unless they were angels, demons, or deeply judgmental saints. So instead of fighting disease, they fought people. When plague struck, logic packed its bags and left town. Fear took over, and fear demanded a target. Witches, heretics, foreigners, beggars, healers, midwives, anyone slightly unusual. If you lived alone, knew herbs, spoke differently, or had owned a cat before Chapter 4 happened to it, congratulations, you were now a public health threat. Entire communities became convinced that burning the wrong people would somehow disinfect reality itself. Fires were lit, trials were rushed, evidence was optional, and confessions were encouraged with enthusiasm. The logic was simple: if we destroy the source of evil, the sickness will stop. The plague, unfortunately, did not attend these meetings. This strategy had several drawbacks. First, it removed people who were often useful. Midwives and healers were targeted precisely because they were present during illness. Killing them reduced care, not disease. Second, executions created crowds, large, tightly packed, emotionally charged crowds, exactly the environment disease preferred. Third, persecution caused panic. People fled towns to avoid accusations, carrying disease into new regions. Others hid symptoms, afraid that coughing too loudly might earn them a trial. Silence replaced honesty. Illness spread quietly behind closed doors. Worst of all, this approach created a feedback loop. When disease worsened, it proved guilt had not been punished enough, so more people were accused, more fires were lit, more communities destabilized themselves in the middle of an epidemic. From a modern perspective, this looks monstrous. From a medieval perspective, it was righteous action. Humanity didn't just fight disease poorly. It fired the one employee who was actually helping and promoted the rats instead. When medieval people realized disease wasn't responding to bloodletting, starvation, and cat elimination, they escalated to a bold new strategy: public self-harm combined with long-distance travel. This was known as the flagellant movement, and it may be one of history's most efficient examples of good intentions doing maximum damage. Flagellants believed plague was divine punishment. The solution, therefore, was to impress God with suffering. Groups of men gathered, stripped down to the waist, and marched from town to town, whipping themselves with chains, leather straps, and occasionally enthusiasm. The logic was simple. If God saw enough blood, he would stop the plague. This logic had already failed in hospitals, but hope springs eternal. These processions were not quiet. They were loud, dramatic, and highly contagious, spiritually and biologically. Flagellants sang hymns, drew crowds, and moved directly through densely populated town. It looked like action. It felt righteous. It gave people the illusion of control in a world where everything else was collapsing. Humanity didn't just misunderstand disease. It declared war on imaginary enemies and, in the process, helped extinction along quite efficiently. The plague didn't need to fight humans. Humans did most of the work themselves. When medieval medicine wasn't busy removing blood or banning vegetables, it turned to its next great idea: poison. Not accidental poison, intentional, measured, doctor-approved poison. Because if disease was strong, the cure clearly needed to be stronger, ideally lethal, but in a controlled way. Medieval infirmaries were less healing centers and more experimental hazards. Remedies included mercury, arsenic, lead, sulfur, and various mysterious powders scraped from rocks that had never helped anyone, ever. These substances were believed to purge illness from the body by forcing it out violently. Vomiting, sweating, diarrhea, all excellent signs. If you felt worse, the medicine was working. Mercury was especially popular. It was shiny, mysterious, and deeply toxic, 3 qualities medieval people found extremely convincing. Doctors prescribed it for skin diseases, parasites, and general bad vibes. Patients who survived the illness often didn't survive the cure. Those who did were rewarded with nerve damage, madness, and a shorter life expectancy, a win by medieval standards. Lead was everywhere: pipes, plates, cups, cookware, cosmetics, even medicine. Wine was sometimes sweetened with lead compounds, giving it a pleasant taste while slowly poisoning anyone who enjoyed it regularly. Entire communities suffered chronic lead poisoning without realizing it, mistaking the symptoms for divine punishment or melancholy. Arsenic enjoyed a dual career as both medicine and murder weapon. In tiny doses, it was believed to restore balance. In slightly larger doses, it restored silence. Unfortunately, medieval measurement tools were not precise. The difference between healing and fatal was often a strong guess and a prayer. What made this especially dangerous was trust. These substances were prescribed by authority figures: doctors, monks, scholars, people who were trained, respected, and absolutely confident. Patients didn't question them. Refusing medicine was irresponsible. If you died, it meant the disease was stronger than the cure. No one seriously considered the alternative explanation. During epidemics, poison treatments multiplied. Desperate people swallowed anything recommended. If one remedy failed, doctors tried another, often stacking poisons on top of poisons, turning sickbeds into chemistry experiments with no safety guidelines. From a modern perspective, this is horrifying. From a medieval perspective, it was cutting-edge science. Humanity didn't just fight disease blindly. It fought it with toxins and congratulated itself for being proactive. At a certain point during medieval epidemics, death simply outpaced organization. People didn't stop dying, they just stopped being dealt with properly. And when a society can't keep up with its dead, things get unpleasant very quickly. During major outbreaks, bodies accumulated faster than they could be buried. Graveyards filled, churches overflowed, coffins became optional. Eventually, corpses were stacked in homes, streets, and public spaces like unwanted furniture no one knew where to put. This wasn't disrespect, it was exhaustion. Normally, burial involved ritual care and distance from the living. During epidemics, that distance vanished. Families kept dead relatives indoors for days, sometimes longer, waiting for priests, gravediggers, or anyone brave enough to help. The air inside homes grew heavy. The smell announced that something had gone very wrong with the concept of indoors. Mass graves became the emergency solution. Trenches were dug hastily, often near towns, rivers, or wells, because digging far away required time, energy, and optimism, all in short supply. Bodies were layered quickly, covered thinly, and forgotten out of necessity rather than neglect. This created a problem medieval people didn't understand, but absolutely experienced. Decay contaminated water sources, insects flourished, animals dug, rain carried everything downhill. Disease didn't just spread, it soaked back into daily life like a terrible memory that refused to leave. Ironically, fear of the dead made things worse. People believed corpses carried spiritual danger, so they avoided touching them. This delayed burials even further. The dead became untouchable, while the living continued sharing the same spaces, breathing the same air, drinking the same water. In some towns, carts were sent through the streets to collect bodies. The call was simple and efficient: bring out your dead. People complied quietly. Arguing required energy they no longer had. Death became routine, familiar, almost administrative. And yet, the response was rarely, "We need to change how we handle this." It was more often, "This is horrible, therefore it must be inevitable." From a modern perspective, leaving corpses among the living looks catastrophic. From a medieval perspective, it was unavoidable. No one had the systems, the manpower, or the knowledge to do better. Not yet. Humanity didn't just struggle against death. It lived beside it, slept near it, and slowly learned the hard way that ignoring decay does not make it go away. At a certain point during medieval epidemics, medieval people noticed a troubling pattern. When one person got sick, everyone around them soon followed. This observation was correct. The conclusion drawn from it was complicated. Isolation felt cruel, unchristian, borderline suspicious. If someone was ill, the moral response was not distance, it was closeness. Family gathered around sickbeds, friends visited, neighbors stopped by to offer prayers, advice, and germs. Leaving someone alone during illness felt like abandonment, and medieval society took abandonment very seriously. So, instead of isolating the sick, people crowded in. Entire households slept in the same room, often the same bed. Sick children were held constantly. Dying parents were surrounded by relatives. This wasn't negligence, it was love. Unfortunately, disease does not respect love. Disease sees love and thinks, "Excellent, more hosts." Medical advice didn't help. Doctors rarely recommended separation. Some even believed fresh company lifted the spirits and improved recovery, which may be emotionally true, but biologically disastrous. A single infected person could quietly infect an entire household within days. Even worse, medieval homes were small, poorly ventilated, and filled with smoke. Windows were tiny or non-existent. Fires burned constantly. Air barely moved. If disease wanted to linger, medieval cottages offered premium accommodations. Quarantine, as a concept, did exist, sort of. Some cities experimented with isolating ships or travelers, but enforcement was inconsistent and often ignored. Merchants argued, clergy protested, people snuck in and out. Rules collapsed the moment they became inconvenient. And then there was fear. People worried that isolating the sick might anger God, who had clearly sent illness for a reason. If disease was punishment, avoiding it might invite worse punishment later. Better to endure together than offend divine authority. From a modern perspective, this is painful to watch. From a medieval perspective, it was compassion. Society chose emotional unity over biological survival, without realizing it was making the worst possible trade. Humanity didn't just fail to contain illness, it embraced it, held its hand, and whispered, "We'll get through this together," which they did, just not all of them. Even when medieval people weren't actively starving themselves on medical advice, they were still quietly losing the long game against nutrition. For the most part of the population, hunger wasn't a crisis, it was background noise, a constant hum of not quite enough, day after day, year after year, generation after generation. The average medieval diet was repetitive, seasonal, and aggressively beige. Bread formed the foundation of life. If you were lucky, it was fresh. If you were not, it was hard enough to qualify as a building material. Vegetables came and went with the seasons. Seasons decided survival. Meat appeared rarely, reserved for holidays, celebrations, or moments when an animal died at the wrong time and had to be eaten before it spoiled. For most people, this meant living in a permanent state of nutritional debt. They were not starving dramatically, they were starving slowly, quietly, politely. The kind of hunger that doesn't kill you outright, it just makes you smaller, weaker, sicker, and far less prepared for the next disaster. Children grew up underfed, their bodies adapted by growing less. Shorter frames, weaker bones, compromised immune systems became normal. Adults carried those deficits forward, where a minor infection could become fatal simply because the body had no reserves left to fight with. Then came the bad years. Crop failure, harsh winters, war, floods. Famine never arrived alone. It arrived on top of a population already running on empty. People who had survived decades of almost enough suddenly faced definitely not enough, and bodies that had learned to survive scarcity had nothing left to give. Ironically, society often made this worse. During shortages, people hoarded. Markets collapsed, prices spiked. The poor watched food exist just out of reach, priced out of survival. Malnutrition turned into mass death not because food didn't exist, but because access didn't. And through it all, hunger was normalized. Complaining implied expectation. Expectation implied entitlement. Hunger was framed as moral discipline, spiritual testing, or simply the natural order of things. From a modern perspective, this looks like systemic failure. From a medieval perspective, it was life as designed. Humanity didn't just face famine, it lived perpetually one bad harvest away from collapse, and somehow endured, thin, exhausted, and stubbornly alive. If disease and hunger didn't finish the job, medieval warfare waited patiently in the background. War in the Middle Ages was not a brief interruption of peace. It was a lifestyle, a recurring subscription humanity never managed to cancel. Wars rarely ended cleanly. Armies didn't fight once and go home. They marched back and forth across the same countryside for years, sometimes decades, destroying the exact resources civilians needed to survive. Crops were burned or trampled. Wells were poisoned. Livestock was stolen or slaughtered. The goal wasn't just to defeat the enemy, it was to make the land itself unlivable. For peasants, this meant famine on demand. You could survive disease one year, hunger the next, and then wake up to soldiers politely turning your entire livelihood into ash because your village happened to exist between two arguing nobles. Armies were also excellent disease delivery systems. Soldiers lived close together, traveled constantly, and carried sickness wherever they went. When they passed through towns, they didn't just take food and shelter, they left infections behind. War didn't pause plagues, it distributed them. Civilians fled violence into forests or cities, creating overcrowding wherever they went. Refugees packed into already struggling towns, pushing sanitation and food systems past collapse. Cities became pressure cookers of hunger, fear, and disease. And through it all, hunger was normalized. Complaining implied expectation. Expectation implied entitlement. Hunger was framed as moral discipline, spiritual testing, or simply the natural order of things. From a modern perspective, this looks like systemic failure. From a medieval perspective, it was life as designed. Humanity didn't just face famine, it lived perpetually one bad harvest away from collapse, and somehow endured, thin, exhausted, and stubbornly alive. If disease and hunger didn't finish the job, medieval warfare waited patiently in the background. War in the Middle Ages was not a brief interruption of peace, it was a lifestyle, a recurring subscription humanity never managed to cancel. Wars rarely ended cleanly. Armies didn't fight once and go home. They marched back and forth across the same countryside for years, sometimes decades, destroying the exact resources civilians needed to survive. Crops were burned or trampled. Wells were poisoned. Livestock was stolen or slaughtered. The goal wasn't just to defeat the enemy, it was to make the land itself unlivable. For peasants, this meant famine on demand. You could survive disease one year, hunger the next, and then wake up to soldiers politely turning your entire livelihood into ash because your village happened to exist between two arguing nobles. Armies were also excellent disease delivery systems. Soldiers lived close together, traveled constantly, and carried sickness wherever they went. When they passed through towns, they didn't just take food and shelter, they left infections behind. War didn't pause plagues, it distributed them. Civilians fled violence into forests or cities, creating overcrowding wherever they went. Refugees packed into already struggling towns, pushing sanitation and food systems past collapse. Cities became pressure cookers of hunger, fear, and disease. And through it all, hunger was normalized. Complaining implied expectation. Expectation implied entitlement. Hunger was framed as moral discipline, spiritual testing, or simply the natural order of things. From a modern perspective, this looks like systemic failure. From a medieval perspective, it was life as designed. Humanity didn't just face famine, it lived perpetually one bad harvest away from collapse, and somehow endured, thin, exhausted, and stubbornly alive. If disease and hunger didn't finish the job, medieval warfare waited patiently in the background. War in the Middle Ages was not a brief interruption of peace, it was a lifestyle, a recurring subscription humanity never managed to cancel. Wars rarely ended cleanly. Armies didn't fight once and go home, they marched back and forth across the same countryside for years, sometimes decades, destroying the exact resources civilians needed to survive. Crops were burned or trampled, wells were poisoned, livestock was stolen or slaughtered. The goal wasn't just to defeat the enemy, it was to make the land itself unlivable. For peasants, this meant famine on demand. You could survive disease one year, hunger the next, and then wake up to soldiers politely turning your entire livelihood into ash because your village happened to exist between two arguing nobles. Armies were also excellent disease delivery systems. Soldiers lived close together, traveled constantly, and carried sickness wherever they went. When they passed through towns, they didn't just take food and shelter, they left infections behind. War didn't pause plagues, it distributed them. Civilians fled violence into forests or cities, creating overcrowding wherever they went. Refugees packed into already struggling towns, pushing sanitation and food systems past collapse. Cities became pressure cookers of hunger, fear, and disease. And through it all, hunger was normalized. Complaining implied expectation. Expectation implied entitlement. Hunger was framed as moral discipline, spiritual testing, or simply the natural order of things. From a modern perspective, this looks like systemic failure. From a medieval perspective, it was life as designed. Humanity didn't just face famine, it lived perpetually one bad harvest away from collapse, and somehow endured, thin, exhausted, and stubbornly alive. If disease and hunger didn't finish the job, medieval warfare waited patiently in the background. War in the Middle Ages was not a brief interruption of peace, it was a lifestyle, a recurring subscription humanity never managed to cancel. Wars rarely ended cleanly. Armies didn't fight once and go home. They marched back and forth across the same countryside for years, sometimes decades, destroying the exact resources civilians needed to survive. Crops were burned or trampled. Wells were poisoned. Livestock was stolen or slaughtered. The goal wasn't just to defeat the enemy, it was to make the land itself unlivable. For peasants, this meant famine on demand. You could survive disease one year, hunger the next, and then wake up to soldiers politely turning your entire livelihood into ash because your village happened to exist between two arguing nobles. Armies were also excellent disease delivery systems. Soldiers lived close together, traveled constantly, and carried sickness wherever they went. When they passed through towns, they didn't just take food and shelter, they left infections behind. War didn't pause plagues, it distributed them. Civilians fled violence into forests or cities, creating overcrowding wherever they went. Refugees packed into already struggling towns, pushing sanitation and food systems past collapse. Cities became pressure cookers of hunger, fear, and disease. And through it all, hunger was normalized. Complaining implied expectation. Expectation implied entitlement. Hunger was framed as moral discipline, spiritual testing, or simply the natural order of things. From a modern perspective, this looks like systemic failure.
From a medieval perspective, this wasn't stubbornness, it was respect. Respect for elders, for tradition, for authority, even when that authority was quietly steering everyone toward extinction. Humanity didn't just struggle against nature, it handcuffed itself to old ideas and refused to let go, even as the cost became impossible to ignore. By the end of it all, the most astonishing thing about medieval humanity isn't how close it came to extinction, it's that it didn't actually manage to finish the job. Given the bloodletting, the starvation, the poisoned medicine, the sewage drinking, the extermination of cats, the plague parades, the overcrowded cities, the endless wars, the smoke-filled lungs, and the unwavering loyalty to catastrophically bad ideas, survival should not have been on the table. And yet, here we are. Medieval people didn't survive because their systems worked. They survived because humans are remarkably stubborn creatures who keep reproducing even when everything else is actively trying to kill them. Survival wasn't engineered. It wasn't planned. It happened in the cracks between disasters, in the pauses between bad decisions, in moments where someone accidentally did the right thing for the wrong reason. Progress arrived slowly, and usually by accident. Someone noticed that isolating the sick sometimes helped. Someone realized certain water sources made people ill. Someone stopped bleeding patients because too many died immediately afterward. These changes didn't arrive as revolutions. They crept in quietly, often without explanation, long before theory caught up. What truly saved medieval people wasn't intelligence, it was adaptation under pressure. When a practice became so lethal that it threatened entire communities, it eventually softened, shifted, or quietly disappeared, not because society admitted it was wrong, but because continuing it became impossible to ignore. And even then, change was resisted every step of the way. The Middle Ages were not a story of ignorance versus enlightenment. They were a story of humans trapped inside belief systems that once made sense, slowly realizing those systems were killing them, and then arguing about it for several centuries. From a modern perspective, it's easy to laugh. From a historical perspective, it's unsettling. Because medieval people weren't uniquely foolish. They were doing what humans always do, trusting what feels familiar, obeying authority, clinging to explanations that offer comfort, and avoiding uncertainty at all costs. They nearly went extinct not because they were weak, but because changing how you think is harder than surviving one more bad year. In the end, humanity didn't escape the Middle Ages through brilliance alone. It escaped by surviving long enough to question itself.
And honestly, that's still how it works today. At the very center of Norse belief stood Yggdrasil, not as a symbol, but as the literal structure holding existence together. To the Vikings, the cosmos was not an abstract void of stars and emptiness. It was a living system, organic and fragile, bound together by a colossal ash tree whose roots and branches touched every corner of reality. These branches were said to creak and groan not from wind, but from the weight of fate itself. The Vikings imagined the universe as something that could be heard, strained, and slowly worn down over time. Yggdrasil was not serene or benevolent. It was under constant attack. Serpents gnawed at its roots, a dragon chewed endlessly at its base, deer stripped its leaves. Decay was not an accident, it was built into the system. Existence in Norse belief was never stable, never safe, never eternal. Even the structure holding the cosmos together was slowly dying. At the base of Yggdrasil lay sacred wells, each tied to a fundamental force of reality. One was the well of wisdom, guarded fiercely and paid for in sacrifice. Another was the well of fate, where the destinies of gods and men alike were carved into existence. These waters sustained the tree, but they also reminded the gods that knowledge and destiny came at a cost. Importantly, Yggdrasil did not separate gods from humans or the living from the dead. All were connected through the same structure. The Vikings did not see themselves as spectators in the universe. They were participants, standing on one of Yggdrasil's branches. Their lives mattered not because they were protected, but because they were exposed. If the cosmos itself was fragile, struggle was natural. If even the gods could not stop decay, then courage mattered more than survival. Meaning did not come from permanence. It came from endurance, while the tree still stood. From the branches and roots of Yggdrasil emerged the 9 worlds, each a complete reality of its own, yet never fully separate from the others. The universe was not neatly layered or logically arranged. It was tangled, overlapping, and occasionally leaking into itself. Closest to the gods stood Asgard, a fortified world of halls, feasts, and endless preparation for war. This was not a paradise of peace, it was a stronghold. Even the gods lived behind walls, fully aware that enemies would one day come for them. Asgard sat high among the branches, but height did not mean safety, it meant responsibility. Below it lay Midgard, the world of humanity. Midgard was not central because humans were important. It was central because humans were vulnerable. Surrounded by oceans and encircled by a massive serpent, it existed in constant tension between order and destruction. Beyond Midgard lay harsher realms, Jotunheim, the land of giants, ancient beings who embodied chaos, raw nature, and unstoppable forces. Giants weren't evil, they were inevitable. Storms, winters, earthquakes, and famine belonged to them. Conflict between gods and giants was not good versus evil, it was control versus collapse. Far below, coiled around the roots of Yggdrasil, lay darker worlds. Niflheim was cold, silent, and lifeless. Hell received those who died without glory. Death here was not punishment, it was simply another destination. Crucially, these worlds were not sealed. Gods walked into human lands, giants invaded divine halls, monsters crossed boundaries when balance failed. Reality was porous, always at risk of rupture. Living within the 9 worlds meant accepting uncertainty. You were never isolated. You were part of a system that could crack or collapse at any moment. At the heart of this cosmos stood Odin, not as a gentle father, but as a restless seeker who ruled through knowledge, sacrifice, and fear. To the Norse, wisdom was never free. It had to be taken, stolen, or paid for in pain. Odin understood this better than anyone because he paid more than all others combined.
He sacrificed an eye at the well of wisdom, trading sight for understanding. He hung himself from Yggdrasil itself, pierced by his own spear, suspended between life and death for 9 days and nights, not as a martyr, as a hunter trapping knowledge. From this ordeal came the runes, symbols of power, fate, and magic that governed reality. The message was unmistakable. Wisdom is born from suffering, not comfort. Odin did not promise safety, he promised preparation. He filled Valhalla not with the innocent, but with warriors, those who could fight when the end finally came.
Under Odin's watch, death itself became a form of recruitment. Not salvation, not escape, preparation. Odin was not all-knowing in the way later gods would be imagined. He knew Ragnarok was coming, but he did not know how to stop it. His wisdom revealed limits, not solutions, and that knowledge made him tragic. The most informed being in the cosmos was also the most aware of inevitable failure. To the Vikings, Odin embodied a brutal truth. Understanding does not save you, it only prepares you. The universe was not designed to reward goodness or punish evil. It rewarded awareness, courage, and endurance. By worshipping Odin, the Vikings accepted a worldview where pain had purpose, sacrifice had meaning, and ignorance was the greatest weakness. Odin did not offer peace, he offered clarity. And in a cosmos balanced on the edge of destruction, clarity was the most valuable gift of all. In Norse mythology, the universe was not held together by harmony, but by tension. The gods themselves existed in a permanent state of conflict, especially with the giants, ancient beings who represented chaos, wilderness, and forces beyond control. This struggle was not a moral battle between good and evil, it was structural. Without conflict, the universe would collapse. The gods of Asgard were not immortal ideals. They aged, they feared death, they relied on constant effort to keep order intact. Among them stood Thor, the blunt force of existence. Where Odin sought knowledge, Thor delivered violence. His hammer was not a symbol of justice, but of containment. Each giant he crushed did not mark victory, it delayed disaster. Thunder, storms, and earthquakes were echoes of this endless struggle bleeding into the human world. Opposite the gods stood the giants, beings older than Asgard itself. They were not villains plotting domination, they were nature unbound. Cold winters, raging seas, wild forests, hunger. The giants existed to test order, weaken it, and eventually break it. Chaos could not be destroyed, it could only be resisted. Between these forces moved Loki, instability given form, neither loyal nor purely hostile, a contradiction. At times, he saved the gods, at others, he doomed them. His cleverness solved immediate problems while planting future catastrophes. To the Vikings, Loki represented intelligence without restraint, the kind that fixes one issue and creates 10 more. This constant friction shaped reality. Peace was temporary, victories were brief. Every feast in Asgard existed only because another battle was coming. The gods understood this. That is why they never sought total victory. Absolute dominance would bring stagnation, and stagnation meant decay. For the Vikings, this cosmic struggle mirrored real life. Storms ruined crops, winters killed livestock, war was inevitable. Survival depended on strength, adaptability, and readiness, not hope for lasting peace. The universe was a battlefield in slow motion, and existence survived only in the narrow space between order and chaos. Above gods, giants, and humans alike, ruled a force even the strongest could not challenge: fate. The Vikings believed every birth, battle, and death was already woven into reality. This power took form as the Norns, 3 ancient beings who lived at the roots of Yggdrasil, shaping existence itself. One governed what had been, one ruled what was unfolding, one carved what was yet to come. Together, they determined the destinies of men and gods alike. Even Odin, with all his sacrifice and wisdom, could not rewrite their decisions. He could see fate approaching, but he could never stop it. This made Norse belief brutally honest. Death was not punishment, and survival was not reward. You lived exactly as long as you were meant to live. What mattered was not the length of your thread, but how tightly it was woven. If the ending was fixed, fear was pointless. Running from fate only wasted the time you were given. Facing it directly, weapon in hand, gave life meaning. A warrior who died screaming was pitied. A warrior who died standing was remembered. Nowhere was this clearer than the Viking view of death. Those who fell bravely in battle were taken to Valhalla, not to rest, but to prepare. Every day they fought, bled, and died again, only to rise by nightfall and feast. Valhalla was not paradise, it was training for the final catastrophe. Fate was not meant to be avoided, it was meant to be met properly. Even the gods knew how the story would end. They knew betrayal was coming. They knew monsters would break free. They knew the cosmos would burn. And yet, they prepared anyway. Meaning did not come from winning. It came from standing firm when defeat was certain. All Norse cosmology bent toward a single, unavoidable event, Ragnarok. It was not a surprise ending. It was embedded into creation itself. The universe was born with an expiration date. Every age, every war, every omen was a slow step toward collapse. Ragnarok did not begin with a single act of evil. It began with imbalance. Promises broke, bonds weakened, winters grew longer and crueler. Brothers turned on brothers. The world ended not only in fire, but in moral decay. As the end approached, the monsters once restrained would break free. Fenrir would snap his chains and devour gods. The world serpent would rise from the sea, poisoning sky and land. The dead would march. Giants would storm the heavens. Even the sun and moon would be consumed. The gods did not misunderstand Ragnarok. They knew it meant absolute defeat. Odin would fall. Thor would strike his final blow and die moments later. No wisdom, no strength, no sacrifice could change the outcome. What makes Ragnarok remarkable is not its destruction, but its response. The gods did not flee. They did not beg for mercy. They armed themselves and marched toward a battle they knew would lose. To the Vikings, this was not failure. It was honor. Knowing the end did not excuse inaction. Meaning came from resistance, not survival. The universe would burn, but it would burn standing. Death in the Norse worldview was not a mystery. It was a destination already accounted for. The universe was built with endings in mind, and death was simply another transition along Yggdrasil's branches. What mattered was not avoiding death, but earning the right kind of ending. Valhalla was the most famous destination, but it was never meant for everyone. It was reserved for those who met violence with defiance, and even there was no rest. The Einarhar fought and died every day, only to rise by nightfall. Death was not the end of struggle. It was recruitment.
Contrary to later Christian ideas, hell was not a place of punishment. It was quiet, cold, and drained of color, a reflection of lives that ended without spectacle. Farmers, children, the elderly, and the sick all arrived there. Their fate was not shameful, it was simply unremarkable. The Vikings did not view hell as evil, they understood it as absence. No glory, no struggle, no echo. This belief created a stark moral hierarchy. Glory was earned through action, not goodness. A kind man who died quietly might be loved, but he would not be celebrated. A violent man who met death without flinching would be remembered. Memory mattered more than morality. Death rituals reflected this mindset. The dead were buried with weapons, tools, and symbols of identity, not because they would use them, but because these objects defined who they had been. To die stripped of your story was worse than dying violently. Norse belief did not promise justice after death. It promised recognition. You would not be judged, you would be remembered, or forgotten. To die well meant meeting the inevitable with dignity. The universe would end, life would end, but how you faced that ending could echo longer than your final breath. Even after the destruction of Ragnarok, Norse mythology did not dissolve into silence. When the flames faded and the seas withdrew, the universe was not erased, it was transformed. This final belief reveals something essential about how the Vikings understood existence. Destruction was never absolute, it was a passage, not a conclusion. After Ragnarok, the world was said to rise again from the waters, cleansed but scarred. The earth would turn green once more. Crops would grow without being sown. The sky would clear. This was not a return to innocence, it was survival after catastrophe. The new world carried memory, not forgetfulness. Some gods endured. Balder, whose unjust death helped trigger the end, would return from the underworld, symbolizing renewal and restored balance. His return did not undo the past, it softened it. Light returned not because darkness was defeated, but because it had already done its worst. A new generation of gods would walk the renewed world, inheriting ruins instead of palaces. They would remember the failures of those who came before them. Wisdom would come not from prophecy, but from experience. Humanity survived as well. Two figures, Leif and Leifthrisir, hid during Ragnarok and emerged afterward to repopulate the world. Their survival was not heroic. It was quiet, and that mattered. The Vikings understood that most survival does not look like legend. It looks like endurance in obscurity. This rebirth reshaped how struggle was understood. Ragnarok was not a warning to behave better. It was proof that collapse was natural. Civilizations fall, gods die, worlds burn. And yet, life returns. The reborn world was not guaranteed to be better. It was simply another chance. Norse mythology did not promise perfection after destruction, only continuation. The cycle would begin again, with new conflicts, new failures, and new endings waiting somewhere ahead. There was no final victory, no eternal peace, only survival, memory, and repetition. And the Vikings lived knowing that even the end of everything was not the end of meaning. If something could rise again after total ruin, then enduring hardship, even briefly, was never pointless. The fire would come, but so would the world that followed. For the Vikings, Norse mythology was not distant myth or abstract theology. It was lived reality. The cosmos of Yggdrasil, the gods, the giants, fate, and Ragnarok were not stories told for comfort. They explained why life felt harsh, unpredictable, and temporary. The universe made sense precisely because it did not promise fairness. Humans were not insignificant, but they were not special either. They occupied Midgard, one branch among many, exposed to the same dangers that threatened gods and monsters alike. Storms, disease, hunger, and war were not punishments. They were expressions of a universe held together by tension. This worldview produced a distinct mindset. If suffering was inevitable, dignity mattered more than comfort. If the end was written, action mattered more than outcome. A person was judged not by success, but by resolve. Fear was understandable, surrender was shameful. Norse mythology rejected the idea of moral reward built into reality. Good people did not always thrive, evil people did not always fall. The gods themselves cheated, lied, and failed. What separated heroes from cowards was not virtue, but response. How you met hardship defined you more than the hardship itself. Daily life reflected this logic. Feasting mattered because famine was always near. Loyalty mattered because betrayal was always possible. Reputation mattered because memory was the closest thing to immortality. To be remembered was to resist oblivion, even briefly. Importantly, this belief did not produce despair. It produced resilience. Knowing that even the gods would die did not weaken faith, it strengthened resolve. If Odin himself could not escape fate, then humans had no reason to feel humiliated by loss. Struggle became a shared condition across all levels of existence. Norse mythology offered no escape from reality. It offered alignment with it. The universe was brutal, so humans were expected to be brave. The future was uncertain, so preparation mattered. The end was guaranteed, so meaning had to be created now. To live as a Viking was to stand inside a collapsing cosmos and choose to act anyway. Not because victory was assured, not because salvation awaited, but because facing the storm head-on was the only honorable way to exist beneath the branches of the world tree. For most of human history, the face was something you never truly saw. You could feel it in the cold, sense it in the way others looked back at you, recognize it through pain, scars, and expressions, but you could not confront it directly. Identity existed without confirmation. You were a presence in the world, but your own image remained largely unknown. The earliest encounters with the self came by accident: a still pond at dawn, a dark pool after rain, a calm river that briefly stopped moving. For a moment, a face appeared, ghost-like, distorted, trembling with every breath of wind. Then it vanished. Water refused to hold the self in place. To early humans, this made reflection uncanny. Seeing yourself was not a tool, it was an event. Without a fixed reflection, identity was built outward, not inward. You knew who you were by your role, your name, your lineage, your actions. Identity lived in memory and reputation, not appearance. The body was functional, not aesthetic. It hunted, labored, healed, aged. It was not examined. This may explain why so many early cultures associated reflections with spirits or souls. A face appearing in water felt less like a confirmation and more like an intrusion. Was that truly you, or something wearing your shape? Without mirrors, there was no daily confrontation with flaws, no studying symmetry, no measuring youth against decay. Wrinkles arrived unnoticed, scars became familiar through touch, not sight. Aging happened quietly. Vanity, as we know it today, had little space to grow. This did not make early humans less self-aware, it made them differently aware. The self was experienced through action, not observation, through endurance, not appearance, through story, not image. The invention of the mirror would shatter this balance, but before polished stone or shining metal ever returned a stable face, humanity lived for thousands of years without knowing exactly what it looked like. And in that long stretch of time, the self was something you were, never something you stared at.
The first mirrors were born from stone, dark, volcanic, and sharp. Polished obsidian, used as early as 6,000 years ago, gave humanity its first reliable way to see itself without distortion. For the first time, reflection became intentional. Unlike water, obsidian did not ripple. It did not vanish when touched. It held the face still. That alone was revolutionary. A human could stand motionless and watch themselves remain. The image was dim, shadowed, imperfect, but undeniably human. These mirrors were rare and powerful. Obsidian had to be mined, shaped, and polished with care. Not everyone owned one. In many cultures, mirrors were bound to ritual, status, and authority. To look into one was not casual, it was prepared for. Reflection became an event. Psychologically, this changed everything. The moment a person saw their own face clearly, they gained distance from themselves. You were no longer only inside your body, you could observe it. A split emerged that had never fully existed before: the observer and the observed. The self became something that could be inspected. This likely felt unsettling. Early mirror users were not trained to interpret their own appearance. Seeing your face reversed, staring back in silence, may have felt confrontational, even threatening. Many cultures treated mirrors as spiritual tools, portals, or vessels capable of holding the soul. Breaking one was not damage, it was danger. Obsidian mirrors were used in ceremony, divination, and burial rites. They were associated with truth, but also with the otherworldly. The dark surface absorbed light, giving reflections a dreamlike quality. Seeing yourself in obsidian was less about beauty and more about recognition. For the first time, humans noticed asymmetry: one eye slightly higher, a scar shaped differently than memory suggested, expressions seen rather than felt. This introduced visual self-awareness, and with it, the earliest seeds of self-consciousness. Once the face could be studied, it could be judged. Once it could be judged, it could be compared. Obsidian mirrors did not simply show people who they were, they quietly introduced the idea that the self could be evaluated from the outside. As societies learned to shape metal, mirrors evolved from dark stone into shining bronze. These new mirrors reflected more light, more detail, and more authority. Unlike obsidian, bronze felt deliberate and controlled. It was unmistakably human-made. Bronze mirrors appeared in ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, and the Mediterranean. They were expensive, fragile, and required constant maintenance. Tarnish was inevitable. Owning a mirror now meant labor, time spent preserving your own reflection. This transformed mirrors into symbols of status. Most people still lived and died without ever seeing their face clearly. Reflection shifted to selective. Who could see themselves, and how often, was tied directly to power. To know your own face became a privilege. Psychologically, bronze mirrors introduced something new: image management. Unlike obsidian, bronze offered clarity. Expressions were readable, features sharpened, hair could be arranged, jewelry placed intentionally. The body became something to curate, not merely inhabit. This mattered deeply in hierarchical societies. Rulers understood that appearance communicated authority. A controlled face suggested control over the world. Calm expressions signaled dominance. Mirrors allowed elites to rehearse themselves, aligning outward image with social role. At the same time, brighter reflection intensified self-scrutiny. Lines, scars, asymmetries became harder to ignore. The mirror no longer showed who you were, it showed how you might be seen. The self became public, even in private. Many cultures responded with boundaries. Mirrors were covered when not in use, reflections avoided at night, prolonged gazing discouraged. These were not empty superstitions, they were psychological safeguards. The human mind was still adapting to the shock of seeing itself so clearly. Bronze mirrors also reinforced gender expectations. Women became increasingly associated with grooming and appearance. The mirror became a tool of social survival as much as self-knowledge. To be seen was to be judged. To prepare was to endure. With bronze, reflection shifted from confrontation to maintenance. The self was no longer just discovered, it was managed. The invention of glass mirrors transformed reflection from privilege into habit. Unlike obsidian or bronze, glass returned an image that was precise, stable, and unforgiving. For the first time, humans could see themselves as others likely saw them, clearly, repeatedly, without ceremony. Early glass mirrors were still rare, but as production improved, reflection moved into daily life. Homes and workshops began to contain mirrors. The self was no longer encountered occasionally, it was encountered constantly. This repetition changed the human mind. With glass came accuracy. Pores, wrinkles, and minute expressions became visible. There was no shadow to hide behind, no blur to soften the image. The face ceased to be symbolic, it became anatomical. Self-awareness intensified into self-monitoring. You could check your appearance at will, adjust posture, practice expressions, smile until it looked convincing. Identity became something rehearsed before presentation. The internal sense of self began competing with the external image staring back. For some, this brought control. For others, anxiety. Glass mirrors also altered the experience of time. Aging, once gradual and easy to ignore, became visible day by day. The mirror introduced comparison not just with others, but with your past self. Memory gained a visual rival. Mirrors did not merely reveal reality, they standardized it. A normal face began to exist. Symmetry became desirable. Deviation became noticeable. Beauty hardened into expectation. The mirror became an authority, not because it was cruel, but because it was consistent. With glass, humanity crossed a threshold. The self became something that could be observed, corrected, compared, and perfected. And once reflection became precise, it became impossible to unsee. As mirrors grew common, something subtle but profound occurred. Humans began to live with a constant double, the self that acts and the self that watches. This division required no philosophy. It emerged naturally the moment reflection became routine. Before mirrors, emotion was felt. With mirrors, emotion could be watched. You could see yourself afraid, see yourself smile, see yourself age. The mind learned to step outside the body and look back in. This created tension. The person you felt yourself to be did not always match the person you saw. Strength could look like fatigue. Confidence could look like doubt. The mirror exposed gaps between inner identity and outer appearance. Over time, people learned to anticipate how they appeared even when no mirror was present. You began to imagine yourself from the outside. And once that happened, the mirror no longer needed to be there.
By this point, the mirror no longer needed to exist physically. It had already been absorbed into the mind. People began to imagine themselves from the outside. How am I standing? How do I look when I speak? What expression am I wearing right now? This was a turning point in human psychology. Self-surveillance became normal. Behavior was no longer shaped only by rules or punishment, but by imagined observation. The mirror taught humans to see themselves as objects within a social space. This had benefits. Empathy expanded. If you could picture how you appeared, you could better imagine how others felt. Social awareness sharpened. Communication became more refined. But there was a cost. Comparison became unavoidable. Once you could see yourself clearly, you could measure yourself against others just as clearly. Beauty, youth, strength, symmetry, traits that had once been subjective, became visually accessible. The mind began ranking the self, often harshly. Mirrors did not create insecurity from nothing. They amplified it. They gave shape to doubts that had once been vague. A feeling of not being enough could now attach itself to a visible detail. Over time, the lived self and the observed self fused into a permanent structure of consciousness. You were no longer simply being, you were watching yourself be. The mirror did not invent self-judgment, it gave it a focus. As mirrors embedded themselves into daily life, they gained symbolic power far beyond their function. Across cultures, mirrors came to represent truth, but not a comforting one. They revealed what could not be hidden, not just on the surface, but beneath it. The reflection was silent, precise, and impossible to argue with. This is why mirrors became linked to fear, taboo, and superstition. They were believed to trap souls, invite spirits, or expose inner corruption. Looking too long was considered dangerous. Covering mirrors after death became common, not merely for luck, but to protect the living from confronting absence too directly. A reflection in a house of mourning felt wrong. Psychologically, this fear makes sense. A mirror does not respond. It does not reassure. It returns only what is given. Humans are wired to read intention in faces, and a face that looks back without emotion breaks that expectation. It feels inhuman. Mirrors also forced confrontation with change. You could lie to yourself about who you were becoming. The mirror could not. Each day it quietly recorded growth, decline, exhaustion, stress. Its reputation for cruelty came not from malice, but from consistency. In religious and philosophical traditions, mirrors became tools of self-examination. To look at yourself was to face truth stripped of narrative. No story, no excuse, only presence. Some embraced this, others avoided it. Mirrors were rarely treated as neutral objects. They were framed, decorated, ritualized, or hidden. Humans learned to soften the psychological impact by controlling when and how reflection occurred. Even today, lighting and angles matter. We instinctively regulate how much truth we allow ourselves to see. Mirrors also destabilized identity. If your reflection changed, had you changed? Or had you always been this way, only now noticing? The self became observable and therefore questionable. This tension made mirrors powerful symbols in myth and storytelling. They revealed monsters, curses, and transformations not because they caused change, but because they exposed it. The fear surrounding mirrors was never really about superstition. It was about being seen by something that could not be persuaded, negotiated with, or deceived. As mirrors became common, they shifted again, this time into tools of discipline. Reflection stopped being occasional and became routine. You didn't just see yourself, you checked yourself. Posture was adjusted in advance, expressions softened before being seen, habits corrected preemptively, not because someone else was watching, but because you imagined how you would look if they were. The mirror trained anticipation. A feedback loop formed. The body acted, the mirror reflected, the mind evaluated, the body adjusted again. Identity became editable. The self became a draft. Social norms hardened. Cleanliness, grooming, posture, expression all became moral signals. Looking composed implied discipline. Looking unkempt implied failure. The mirror helped transform appearance into evidence of character. This control required no authority, no ruler enforced it. The mirror did the work silently. Once standards were internalized, people enforced them on themselves. Shame became private, correction became automatic. This is why mirrors flourished alongside urbanization and complex societies. Large populations require predictability. Mirrors helped produce it. But they also narrowed acceptable ways of being. Difference became visible. Deviation became measurable. Bodies that did not fit expectations were no longer just different, they were visibly different. The mirror did not create exclusion, it made it precise. Psychologically, this intensified self-criticism. The mind learned to scan for flaws the way a guard scans for threats. Even at rest, the internal mirror stayed active. You were never fully off stage. And yet, mirrors could also be used deliberately. Performers, leaders, negotiators, anyone who needed to influence others used reflection to craft presence. The mirror could train confidence as easily as insecurity. Self-awareness sharpened into self-command. By now, the mirror was no longer passive. It shaped posture, emotion, and behavior before action occurred. Humans were no longer just seeing themselves, they were governing themselves through the image staring back. Eventually, the mirror no longer needed to be in the room at all. Its function had already moved inside the mind. People learned to picture themselves constantly from angles they could never physically see. This was the final transformation. The mirror became internal. An invisible observer followed you everywhere, while speaking, walking, laughing, even while alone. It evaluated not just appearance, but behavior, emotion, and thought. Am I acting correctly? Am I reacting properly? Do I look like the person I believe to be? Personality became performative, even in private. You didn't just feel anger, you watched yourself feel it. You didn't just experience joy, you assessed how it appeared. Emotional life gained a second layer, observation. For some, this brought clarity and growth. Patterns could be noticed, impulses restrained, courage rehearsed. But there was a cost. When the observer never rests, rest becomes difficult. Silence becomes crowded. Even solitude feels public. The mind loses the ability to simply be. This is where the mirror's psychological power becomes most intense. The self splits again, not between body and image, but between experience and judgment. You are no longer just living moments, you are evaluating them in real time. Modern anxiety thrives here.
The fear of being seen persists even when no one is watching. The internal mirror does not blink, it does not tire, it does not forgive easily. It remembers old reflections and compares them to new ones. And yet, within this tension, deep self-knowledge becomes possible.
Without the mirror, there is no introspection. Without introspection, there is no deliberate identity. The same tool that creates insecurity also creates consciousness. This is the paradox of reflection. The mirror fragments the self, but it also allows it to be shaped intentionally. It can trap you in endless self-criticism or grant awareness powerful enough to change behavior. By this stage, humanity no longer needed polished stone, metal, or glass to see itself. The mirror had become a permanent feature of the human mind, watching, questioning, defining who we believe ourselves to be. The invention of the mirror gave humanity a gift no other tool ever had: the ability to confront the self directly, repeatedly. It did not increase strength, speed, or survival skills. It gave awareness, and awareness changed everything. Once humans could see themselves clearly, identity became visible. The self could be examined, improved, doubted, reshaped. This brought growth, empathy, self-correction, and intention. People could align how they felt with how they appeared. They could become deliberate versions of themselves. But this gift came with a cost. Seeing yourself meant judging, remembering, comparing. The mirror made the self measurable, and measurement invites hierarchy. Beauty, youth, and symmetry became currencies. Aging became something to track instead of accept. Difference became something to explain or hide. The mirror did not invent insecurity, vanity, or shame, but it gave them a fixed reference point. Doubt gained a surface, fear gained a face. The self became both subject and object, actor and audience. This tension remains unresolved. Modern life is saturated with reflections, literal and digital. Screens, cameras, profiles, all extend the mirror endlessly. The question introduced by the first polished stone has never gone away. Who am I really? The one I feel myself to be, or the one I see? The mirror offers no answer, it only shows. Yet, without it, much of what we call selfhood would not exist. The ability to recognize yourself is the foundation of responsibility, memory, and choice. The mirror fractured the self, but it also made it conscious. It did not simply allow humans to see their faces, it forced them to live with themselves as visible beings in the world. To be human now is to carry that reflection everywhere, sometimes as insight, sometimes as burden. The mirror remains what it always was: silent, precise, indifferent. It does not tell you who you are, it only asks you to look. By the late Renaissance, Italy was saturated with beauty and restless because of it. Painting had reached astonishing realism. Architecture could command space and emotion. Poetry could shape entire worlds with language alone. Yet music, for all its sophistication, still hovered on the edges of storytelling. It enhanced moments, but it rarely carried them. Music existed everywhere, but rarely at the center. In churches, it elevated prayer. In courts, it flattered power. In streets and taverns, it entertained. What it did not do, at least not fully, was sustain drama. Characters did not live and change through music. Stories were spoken or sung, but never truly embodied by sound. At the same time, Italian thinkers were gripped by a powerful idea, one the Greeks had once realized. Scholars believed Greek tragedy had unified poetry, music, and performance into a single, overwhelming experience. Not background music, not decoration, but voices carrying emotion, narrative, and meaning together. Historical accuracy mattered less than the longing it created. Renaissance intellectuals did not just want to study the past, they wanted to revive it. They imagined ancient audiences moved to tears by sung drama, emotions guided as much by melody as by words. Italy was uniquely prepared for this experiment. City-states like Florence, Venice, and Mantua were wealthy, competitive, and obsessed with cultural prestige. Patrons demanded novelty. Artists sought freedom. Philosophers wanted proof that art could shape the soul. There was also quiet frustration with existing music. Polyphony, multiple voices weaving together, technically brilliant but emotionally confusing. Words were often lost in complexity, meaning dissolved into sound. If music was to tell stories, something had to change. The stage was set not by invention but by dissatisfaction, a sense that art had reached its limits, a feeling that emotion needed clearer expression. Music needed to speak directly, not ornamentally. Opera was not born from excess confidence, it was born from a question. What if music stopped decorating stories and became the story itself? This question would reshape Western music forever. Florence became the laboratory for the idea, not because it was quiet or conservative, but because it was bold enough to experiment. The city had long treated culture as a workshop, a place where art was engineered rather than simply admired. If a new form was to be invented, it would happen here. At the center of this experimentation was a small circle of poets, musicians, and philosophers who met in private homes, the Florentine Camerata. They were united not by style, but by frustration. Contemporary music was too complex, too obsessed with technical display, and unable to express genuine human emotion. Their radical idea, music should serve the words, not overpower them. They argued Greek drama had been sung in a simple, speech-like style, where melody followed natural language. Whether historically true mattered less than conviction. They wanted music that spoke. This was dangerous territory. Renaissance music prized polyphony, the interweaving of multiple independent vocal lines, mathematically elegant, intellectually respected. To abandon it was to challenge centuries of tradition. Yet the Camerata pushed forward. They imagined a style where a single voice carried the text clearly, supported by minimal harmony. Every word, every emotional shift would be understood. Music would no longer blur meaning, it would sharpen it. This was not merely a technical change, it was philosophical. Emotion was central to art. Art's purpose was to move the listener. If music failed to do that, no complexity could redeem it. Performers were no longer just voices, they became characters, narrative bearers. Audiences were invited to listen differently, not for cleverness, but for feeling. Florence provided the perfect environment for such an experiment. Wealthy patrons funded trials, small audiences tolerated failure. Artists were encouraged to test ideas rather than repeat formulas. The Camerata did not set out to invent opera, they set out to solve a problem. In doing so, they opened a door that could never be closed. Ideas alone were not enough. If music was to become drama, someone had to risk putting theory on stage. That step was taken at the very end of the 16th century. Composers began creating works that hovered uneasily between music, speech, and theater, things that did not yet have a name. One of the first was Jacopo Peri, a musician working in Florence under noble patronage. Peri was not inventing a spectacle, he was testing a question. Could a single voice, shaped like heightened speech, carry an entire story? The result was new and strange. Instead of multiple interwinding voices, one character sang at a time. The melody followed the natural rise and fall of spoken Italian, stretching certain syllables, tightening others. This style became known as recitative, not fully song, not fully speech, but suspended between the two.
Early audiences did not hear polished masterpieces, they heard experiments. The music was sparse, the accompaniment was minimal.
The drama intimate. But something unprecedented was happening. Characters no longer paused to sing, they were singing the story itself. Words could finally be understood. Emotion could unfold in real time. Music stopped interrupting drama and began serving it. A character's hesitation, grief, or anger could now stretch across musical time instead of being spoken and forgotten. These early operas often drew on mythological subjects, especially Greek stories. This was intentional. Myth provided emotional weight without requiring realism. Audiences already knew the endings. The focus was not suspense, but expression, how it felt to move toward fate. Importantly, these first works were not written for public theaters. They were performed in courts and private spaces for educated listeners willing to pay attention. Opera began not as popular entertainment, but as intellectual art. There were doubts. Some found the style monotonous, others missed the richness of polyphony. But even critics sensed something irreversible had begun. Once music learned to speak clearly, it could no longer be merely decorative. These early experiments were fragile, imperfect, limited, but they proved one essential thing. A human voice, given enough space and intention, could carry an entire world. What these works had not yet shown was that they could be powerful. That transformation came with Claudio Monteverdi, the composer who turned a fragile concept into living art. Monteverdi understood what his predecessors only sensed. If opera was to survive, it could not remain academic. It had to move people. Emotion had to come first, even if rules were broken along the way. Where earlier composers treated music cautiously, Monteverdi treated it like a weapon, bending harmony, rhythm, and melody to serve feeling. His operas did not merely present stories, they breathed. Characters argued, begged, raged, and collapsed emotionally, and the music followed them without restraint. Dissonance was no longer a flaw, it became a tool. When a character suffered, the harmony suffered with them. When desire surged, music stretched beyond polite boundaries. Monteverdi also expanded the orchestra's role. Instruments were no longer just support, they became emotional commentators, coloring scenes with tension, tenderness, or dread. Silence itself became meaningful. A pause could wound as deeply as a note. This shift changed how audiences experienced opera. They were no longer listening politely, they were pulled into the inner lives of characters. Mythological figures stopped feeling distant and symbolic. They became recognizably human, capable of jealousy, fear, regret, and longing. Crucially, Monteverdi proved clarity and richness could coexist. Words remained intelligible, but the musical world around them grew deep and expressive. Opera no longer had to choose between intellect and emotion. It could command both. This was the turning point. After Monteverdi, opera was no longer a question mark. It was a viable, compelling art form. Composers across Italy took notice. Courts requested new works. Experiments became expectations. Opera began to loosen its elite grip. While still expensive, it was no longer confined to philosophical circles. Its emotional power made it accessible even to listeners who did not understand its theoretical origins. What Monteverdi achieved was not perfection, but momentum. He showed opera could evolve, absorb influences, and deepen over time. Once audiences had felt music think, desire, and suffer on stage, there was no returning to simpler forms. Opera was alive, and living things do not stay contained for long. Once opera proved it could move hearts, it needed a new home, one less restricted than princely courts and private salons. That home became Venice, wealthy, crowded, theatrical, and most importantly, public. Here, opera left exclusive patronage and entered the marketplace. Public opera houses appeared, funded not by a single ruler, but by ticket sales.
This single shift transformed the art form. For the first time, opera had to appeal not just to elites, but to paying audiences with varied tastes and expectations. This changed what stories were told and how. Mythological subjects remained popular, but plots were reshaped for drama, spectacle, and emotional immediacy. Characters became more extreme. Love, betrayal, disguise, jealousy, and revenge dominated the stage. Opera leaned into excess because excess sold. Music adapted accordingly. Recitative still carried the story forward, but arias, extended arias, grew in importance. These allowed characters to pause, explore emotion in depth, and the audience to sit inside it. Singers became stars, admired not just for voices, but for personalities and expressive power. Venice also transformed staging. Opera houses invested in elaborate sets, moving scenery, and visual effects. Gods descended, palaces collapsed, storms erupted indoors. Opera became a total sensory experience, combining sound, sight, and narrative into something overwhelming. Some intellectuals worried that spectacle was overtaking story, that technique might overpower meaning. These debates never fully disappeared, but they were signs of growth, not decay. Opera had discovered something fundamental. The human voice, when disciplined and unleashed, could move, astonish, and transform. Singers were pushed into extremes, long phrases without breath, sudden leaps across wide ranges, sustained notes defying the body's limits. The voice was no longer natural, it was trained, stretched, disciplined, and perfected. This gave rise to a new performer, the virtuoso singer. Technique became spectacle. Audiences came not only for stories, but to witness feats bordering on the impossible. A single aria could stop the drama entirely, holding listeners in place through sheer sonic force. Nowhere was this more evident than in the rise of the castrati. Male singers altered before puberty to preserve high voices with adult lung power. Their voices were powerful, flexible, and eerily pure. To modern ears, the practice feels brutal. To 17th century audiences, it was miraculous. Castrati became stars, commanding enormous fees, inspiring devotion, and shaping how composers wrote music. Roles were designed around their abilities. Emotional expression became inseparable from vocal display. Grief, love, rage, and triumph were no longer simply expressed, they were prolonged, magnified, explored in detail. An aria could stretch a single emotion across minutes, forcing the audience to endure it. Opera taught listeners how to live inside feeling, not just recognize it. At the same time, this emphasis created tension. Critics worried spectacle might overshadow story, that technique might overpower meaning. These debates never fully disappeared, but they were signs of growth, not decay. Opera had discovered something fundamental. The human voice, when disciplined and unleashed, could move, astonish, and transform.
Opera carried emotion more directly than any instrument. It bypassed intellect and went straight to the body. By pushing voices beyond ordinary limits, opera expanded the emotional range of art itself. It asked not just what stories could be told, but how much feeling a human being could contain and release through breath alone. As opera matured, its freedom demanded structure. The early years had been experimental, even chaotic, but widespread popularity created new pressures. Audiences wanted clarity, singers wanted showcases, composers needed balance. Out of this tension emerged a more defined dramatic architecture. Recitative carried the plot forward quickly and efficiently. Arias paused time, allowing action to stop so feeling could deepen. Desire lingered, regret expanded, triumph unfolded slowly. This rhythm, movement followed by reflection, became opera's heartbeat. Librettists learned to design scenes around emotional peaks. Conflict had to justify an aria. Characters were built not only through action, but through how they sounded when isolated in emotion. Identity became musical. Different cities favored different balances. Naples emphasized vocal brilliance and formal beauty. Drama served the music. Elsewhere, emotional realism carried more weight. Regional styles competed, borrowed, and refined the form through rivalry. Opera also developed clearer character types. Heroes, lovers, villains, and rulers gained recognizable musical languages. Certain rhythms suggested authority. Melodic shapes implied vulnerability. Audiences learned to read these signals instinctively. Music became narrative shorthand. This growing order did not eliminate intensity, it focused it. Containing emotion within formal boundaries made it more powerful. A single aria at the right moment could resonate longer than constant motion ever could. This balance mirrored broader cultural changes. Europe was organizing politically, socially, and aesthetically. Opera reflected this shift. Passion was still celebrated, but it had to be framed, shaped, and delivered with precision. Some critics mourned the loss of early rawness. Others welcomed the refinement. What mattered was that opera now had a language flexible enough to survive change. It could absorb new tastes without losing its core. By pacing emotion, opera secured its future. It was no longer dependent on novelty or shock. It could build tension, release it, and leave audiences changed. By the early 18th century, opera had outgrown its Italian origins. What began as a Renaissance solution to fuse music and drama had become something far larger. Opera was no longer an experiment, it was an export. Italian opera traveled with astonishing speed. Composers, singers, and impresarios moved from city to city, carrying scores, techniques, and expectations. Italian became the dominant language of opera, even where it was not spoken fluently. Audiences learned to feel emotion through sound before understanding words. Abroad, opera became a symbol of refinement, power, and prestige. Courts built opera houses not just for entertainment, but to signal sophistication. Hosting opera meant belonging to a larger cultural world. As opera crossed borders, it adapted. Local tastes reshaped it. Some regions favored spectacle, others moral restraint. Yet Italian foundations remained. Emphasis on voice, the alternation of recitative and aria, and the belief that music could embody emotion more truthfully than speech. This expansion intensified debate. Was opera meant to impress or to move? Should singers dominate or should drama lead? Conflict did not weaken the form, it sharpened it. Each challenge forced composers to refine their approach. Italian opera's success revealed something about human psychology. People did not need to understand every word to feel invested. Tone, tension, breath, and silence communicated emotion directly. Opera proved that feeling could travel faster than language. At the same time, opera marked a turning point in how art circulated. It was no longer bound to a single place or elite group. It moved through networks of theaters, patrons, and audiences. Opera became one of the first truly international art forms. Even as it transformed abroad, it never severed itself from its Italian origins. Music served drama. Voices embodied emotion. No matter how ornate or restrained it became, opera carried this founding principle within it. What began in small Florentine rooms now echoed across continents. Opera had escaped its birthplace, but never the idea that human stories deserved voices large enough to contain them. The birth of opera in Italy was not the creation of a genre so much as the creation of a new way of thinking about art. Before opera, music and drama existed beside each other. After opera, they became inseparable. Sound was no longer decoration, it became language. Opera proved music could do more than accompany emotion, it could be emotion. A trembling phrase could replace a paragraph of dialogue. A held note could express indecision, desire, or despair more clearly than speech. In doing so, opera changed how audiences understood truth on stage. Authenticity was no longer about realism, it was about emotional accuracy. This reshaped performers. Singers were not merely interpreters, they became vessels of feeling, merging technique with psychology. Convincing performance required understanding why a character sang the way they did.
Opera demanded disciplined emotion, not improvisation. It also reshaped audiences. Listening became active. To follow an opera, you learned to read musical cues, anticipate emotional turns, and sit inside extended moments of feeling. Opera trained patience. It asked listeners to stay with emotion longer than everyday life allowed. Most importantly, opera introduced a lasting idea. Art could heighten reality without escaping it. Stories might be mythical or exaggerated, but the emotions were recognizably human. Love hurt the same. Loss sounded the same. Fear tightened the breath the same. Opera exaggerated form to reach truth. This is why opera endured long after the Renaissance questions that created it faded. Even when styles changed, languages shifted, and theaters evolved, the core impulse remained. Humans still wanted stories larger than life, but truer than words alone. Opera did not replace earlier art forms, it absorbed them. Poetry, theater, music, architecture all fused into a single experience. That fusion became its strength. Opera succeeded because it answered a deep human need, to hear inner life made audible. When music learned to speak, it did not just create a new genre, it gave emotion a voice powerful enough to fill a room, a city, and eventually the world.